Hey guys, Matt here with the Graphic Ramblers. I'm doing an interview today here with artist and writer extraordinaire Steve Hip of the Ladybug Blues. Your work is amazing. What are you here promoting today?
I'm selling prints of It's My Party and I'll Die If I Want To, and also Kickstart My Heart. One's an 8-page comic about a female protagonist who looks suspiciously like me, puts her hand in marriage as a reward on her Kickstarter, and then someone backs it. And then the other one is a girl whose lifelong dream is to become a ghost and haunt things. And then she does that.
I gotta say, It's My Party and I'll Die If I Want To. I was thinking we were making it a 24-hour comic day. It's probably my favorite thing to come out of that.
Thank you.
It's amazing. You should all find it.
Yeah, it took more than 24 hours and it was less than 24 pages. But it's a comic.
It's worth it though.
It's definitely a comic.
It's great.
It is.
But what would you say your big influences for that were?
The song It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want To.
Of course.
Because then I just made that into a pun. And then I wrote a story around that. That's my normal writing process. Is I come up with a sweet title and then I just,
Seems like the best way to do it, I gotta say.
Thank you.
People have been doing it for years now.
Yeah, I don't know why someone would do it the other way around. One time I wrote a comic and then I had to name it after, and I couldn't. It's called Circus Circus. It has nothing to do with circus. Nothing. It's for kids.
Oh.
It's a comic that kids could read. Circus Circus.
What would you say your main influences are? How did you get into making comics?
I really like Casey Green, the webcomic artist, J.H. Williams III, Robbie Rodriguez. I like comics that just if I ever wanted to tell a feature film story, I couldn't make all of that on my own. You can do a comic on your own and tell a story that long and complicated. So it's just I can have complete control over everything and do it in the safety and warmth of my own room. And also, I like reading comics. People who read comics are huge nerds, but people who make comics are really cool. And so that's a way for me to not be a huge nerd. Because that would be so embarrassing. Oh my god.
If you hosted a podcast about them or something?
Ew.
Kind of dorky.
Oh god.
So where can people find your stuff?
Right there.
Besides at the
I have a Tumblr called chipchopapolis.tumblr.com.
The best name is Tumblr of all time.
CHIPP chopapolis.tumblr.com. I have a website, christinehip.com. Hip has 2 P's. I have a portfolio. It's in that black binder over there. So if you somehow found it, you could look at that and see some of my work. That's the only place you can find Bounty Hunter Space Besties. That's underground. Just because it's not published yet, so that's even more desirable.
I want to read it just based off the name of the book.
Again, start with the title, and then everything
You're
writes
really
itself
awesome.
in there. Yeah.
And I have one last question for you. You had some very outspoken opinions about this. How do you feel about Batman?
Yeah, Batman costumes should have nipples on it, and there should be 6 of them like a real Batman. Yes.
Of course.
Tim Burton fucked up.
He did. He dropped
4
the ball.
times. 4 times.
Well, thank you for talking with us today. Enjoy the rest of the con. Graphic Ramblers signing off.